Sarah, and welcome to Resistance Radio here with John Kane and Regan DeLoggins. It is once again a pleasure to be a part of the WBAI programming schedule, and like I said, it's great to be here. Got a couple of things we're going to address. I want to do a little bit of a recap on my trip out to my old high school to talk about the mascot issue. So we'll talk about that a little bit, and then Regan's going to update us on some of what's happening out in Shinnecock territory. Regan, are you with us?
Still waiting.
Okay, all right. Well, she'll be with us shortly, I am sure. So I went out to my old high school, Cambridge Central School, otherwise known as the Cambridge Indians, and it was an interesting trip. I went to school there from early elementary right up through high school, and graduated with the class of '78, and they do call themselves the Cambridge Indians. And as much as I've addressed this issue at other schools, I've usually been called upon by school board members, by superintendents, or even some students and student organizations on occasion. But I hadn't taken it to my own high school, so this is what I did. I had written an email to the superintendent. Excuse me. I'd written an email to the superintendent. I read a statement in front of the board, and just so you know, these don't usually go that well in terms of how the community members take this, because they really dig in. When you get a white community that's been calling themselves Indians for decades, and in some cases, over half a century, they feel like a voice. Even if I was an alumnus, graduated there, part of that community at one point, they feel like I'm going there to take something from them. Now, and in the situation with Cambridge, what was kind of unique is there's a family that I grew up with there, another Native family. They had left the area. They didn't graduate. The boys that I went to school with, they didn't graduate from there. They left when I was in junior high. Went back and they lived in Oneida for a little while. These boys were Onondaga. Their father's Oneida. Their mother, who they weren't raised by, but their birth mother was Onondaga. But they went and they moved back to Oneida territory for a brief instance. And then they came back, and they came back after high school. They graduated, and ironically, the school that they graduated from which was called Stockbridge. They called themselves the Stockbridge Indians. So it's like this thing just kind of follows you around. But the thing about Cambridge, unlike living in a community that has Native people around, when you go to someplace like Cambridge, you're the novelty when you're the Native family or you're the Native student. And these guys kind of like being that. And the fact that it was the Cambridge Indians, they kind of embrace this. So they are advocates. They support being the Cambridge Indians. And if anything, regardless of their ancestry, their mother being Onondaga and their father being Oneida, these guys really more identified as Cambridge Indians than as Onondagas or Oneidas. So it's an awkward thing, and it's actually kind of a sad thing. Now, they had kids, and those kids went to school there, K through 12. And so their identities are tied to this mascot issue. These guys have never been really part of a Native community. Like I said, they lived in Oneida for a short period of time, but was never really, they weren't activists, But here's the other irony is these weren't just friends of mine. I married their cousin. My wife Brenda, is their first cousin. I actually met my wife through these guys at a family reunion. The difference is their path would lead them to go live amongst white people, and my path would lead me to become, and not because of the marriage or anything, but my path would lead me to become a Native community member. And I've lived in several. I've lived in Oneida. I lived in Mohawk territory. I've lived in, now I live here out in Seneca territory. So My path is completely different. I'm an activist. I've been fully engaged in Native issues for my entire adult life. And there's a cost that came to that. I went through my own legal battles over this stuff. So when I weigh in my old high school about what's wrong with this appropriation of a Native mascot, I'm not speaking about just my personal experience, because frankly, I grew up there, and although I got the ribbing, I mean, I got called Chief or Wapu or Pocahontas, or I even got called a red N-word once. But you know what? It was my buddies. It was guys. I wasn't being bullied for it. It wasn't like I was being picked on. It was more like being just smart asses to each other. So. And I'm not excusing it, but I'm just saying that was I didn't feel traumatized by it. But at 60 years old, I still remember all this stuff. So when I go to Cambridge, I'm not talking about my personal experience or being persecuted or discriminated against or bullied or anything like that. What I'm talking about is the fact that you guys are still promoting a stereotype. You're teaching, generations. Look, I graduated in 78, a long time ago. You're teaching generations, decade after decade after decade of kids that stereotyping is fine, that appropriating somebody's culture and then claiming it is fine, that mocking somebody's culture is fine, and it's not. So as much as I go there to raise an issue, or this Native family that still lives there, they have their own personal feelings about it. Or look, all of these guys who peaked in high school and are now 40, 50, 60, even 70 years old. Look, this isn't about you. It's not about us. It's about the kids. So I did it. I spoke at the school board meeting. I thought the school board and the administrators were receptive. I was also pleasantly surprised because in the run up to this, I had been contacted by a group that they call themselves a social justice group, and they've been troubled by this, and it's just kind of serendipitous that all of a sudden I come on the stage as a graduate, a Native voice, and so they had my back, and so they spoke at the board meeting. I thought we made pretty compelling arguments about this, about all of this stuff. Others can raise that question a little bit to see if we were as successful or not. I mean, look, those people from the community who spoke up, including the other Native family, look, they all said the same thing. Oh, it's I always thought being Cambridge Indian was great. We promoted pride. We promoted I don't know. It's mostly some of honor, pride, all of that stuff. Just kind of this standard fare associated with being proud of their mascot. But see, unlike being a panther or a lion or eagles, these guys make this their identity, and it's really sad because if you have Native ancestry, and you're more drawn to the mascot identity, the Cambridge Indians, than Onondaga or Oneida, or in my case, Mohawk or Gunyagahaga. That's kind of sad, and that's what was the experience there. Look, one non-Native guy stood up there and he even made the proverbial "you people" comment. It sounded like Archie Bunker. I mean, it was like, really, we still have this thing where you have white people who refer to other people other than them as "you people." So, look, I wasn't on their agenda. I spoke during the public comment sessions. I had requested to be on the agenda. I will be on the agenda in December. And we'll see how this goes. I don't envy a school board. This is tough stuff because I looked at that school board and I got the sense that they agreed. And there are people in that community, not just the ones who spoke, but others who, they love the mascot, but they know that it's got to change. Now, why do they know it's got to change? Well, because they're changing. The Washington football team changed their name. There are schools that are dropping these names like flies. They know that it's unsustainable. Why? Because it's inappropriate. Not because of political correctness run amok or any of that other nonsense. they look, they just know that it's something that's got to go. I mean, it's just what they know. But a school board has to deal with the fact that there's still a large segment of the community, and I would say the majority of the community, that says, "Oh, hell no, you're not taking that from us. We're Indians." I mean, they'll look at me as some sort of, you know, I don't know, some outsider that's trying to take something from them. And so I know that schools, this is a tough challenge for them. I mean, it's a tough challenge because they have to deal with this whole idea that they're going to have an angry, segment of the community. I mean, and some of the anger can translate into things like voting for school budgets, trying to replace, school board members. This hostility can get really, 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 really tense. So as much as they know they have to change it, they also know they've got to somehow temper the mood of the community. So it's a tough lift. And for somebody like me, I can go in there and look, if they want to blame me, if they want to hate me, I'm going to leave. I'm going to come back home. So for me, I kind of go there almost as a service, right? I'm going to try to help the school board make this decision. I'm going to help them diffuse some of this stuff, but I'm also going to try to make substantial and compelling arguments about why this is such a bad practice. The fact that you are essentially taking what should be a safe place for students, and you're turning it into a place where you're promoting stereotypes, where you're promoting essentially discrimination. I mean, it's a race-based mascot, and in the times that we live in now, post George Floyd, the rise of Black Lives Matter, obviously the Washington football team changing its name. In the times that we live in, it is becoming very, very difficult to not address racial equity or social justice. It's hard not to address those things. And if you've got a race-based mascot, you're already digging out of a hole with that. So anyway, that was my experience. I think it went well. We'll see, how soon this changes. I will admit, when we faced this issue here in the suburbs of Buffalo, in the village of Lancaster. They started the process of evaluating this thing, kind of knowing that they were going to have to change it, expecting they could drag it out through the early part of the year and then change it during the summer shutdown. They didn't last that long. They started addressing this thing in January, and by March they voted unanimously to change it. I don't know that it'll go that fast in Cambridge, but it might, because the sooner you can get through this thing, the better. So anyway, that was my experience, and I wanted to give a little bit of that update. I don't know, Regan, are you still with us yet?
Regan is connected.
All right, Regan, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. I've just been listening.
Okay. Well, the funny thing is that, Shawnee and I used to talk about this, because even as we were talking about schools like Neshaminy and in Pennsylvania, and even some of the schools local to the New York City area that were addressing this thing, we always kind of had it that, look, the schools that we went to, they were called Indians. I think hers was Indians too, or Warriors. I don't know. But I always knew that I was going to have to bring this up back at my old high school. Now, I will say WAMC, which is the NPR station that covers a big part of upstate New York, the Capital District area. They go into New England, up to the North Country. I mean, they cover a large area. They did an interview before and after. Dave Lucas did the interview. I posted it on my Let's Talk Native page, so if anybody wants to check any of that out. And I thought they were fair. I mean, I will say in the postmortem, in the interview he did afterwards, and the piece that he did on the radio, he said that it didn't look like this was going to change anytime soon. And I don't know what that's based on. He did get a little bit of an interview with the superintendent. And, frankly, I think that board members and the superintendent kind of, in a way, tilted their hand a little bit that this was something that they were going to have to do. And they, by acknowledging, the Washington football team and so many other things, I think the handwriting is on the wall. And and I was glad that WAMC had covered it. We'll see. I mean, I just gave an interview to North Country Public Radio with David Summerstein, and we'll see if this gets covered there too. And the reason I wanted to reach out to the press wasn't just to try to inundate the little village of Cambridge, but there are schools all around there, Mechanicville, Schoharie. There are a lot of schools in the Capital District area, and stretching all the way down to the New York City area that are still struggling with this issue. And and I think I'm a reasonable voice in this thing. I can speak intelligently, not from a having been bullied standpoint, but just speak about it generally about how the practice is bad. I can do that, and I think I can do it in a way that doesn't look like I'm trying to slam people, or insult people or criticize people, but just kind of make it about the students and make it about trying to create an environment. Because here's the other thing: all of these mascots do the same thing. They cast us in the past. They grab either some Plains Indian headdress profile or a Woodlands Indian headdress profile, and that's what all these kids are being taught as an Indian. And of course, the word isn't even appropriate as far as I'm concerned. Or they're being told it's a redskin, a warrior, a red raider, or a savage perhaps. And none of those words are appropriate. If you want to teach about Native people, I'll help. I'll go to your school. I'll come address students and faculty. I'll do it on my own time, on my own dime. I mean, because I think educating people, it's part of the reason we do this show. We do this show to educate. Yeah, we're resistance radio, but what we're educating people about is our resistance. And that resistance is about trying to maintain Native identity in spite of where we live, in spite of the tremendous amount of forces that are out there trying to assimilate us. I mean, Regan, you live in the city. You live in an environment that is really, really difficult to maintain identity that is not just an identity tied to cultural diversity, but tied to distinction. And I don't know. I mean, it's probably trickier for you because you don't have the support of a whole big Native community like I do.
Yeah, I mean, it's really different in terms of, well, I think it's interesting when people talk about urban indigenous populations, specifically Manhattan, which is the Lenape name for New York City, in terms of like indigenous relations, because the Lenape Hoyok, which is Lenape term for Lenape people, were so aggressively removed from the territory in a three-pronged approach, pushing them into Oklahoma and into so-called Canada. And they are not federally recognized here on this land. They're recognized as Delaware Indians in Oklahoma, as well as Stockbridge Munsee in Wisconsin. And then there's 3 tribes that are federally recognized in so-called Canada. But they're not federally recognized here on their land, which is incredibly disturbing. So it's not like there's a very specific nation's hold here in Lenape-Hoking. Rather, there are a number of people from a number of different nations. New York City has the largest urban indigenous population. Over 100,000 people identify as indigenous here, and a majority of those people are Taino and Arawak from Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic. So the type of cultural influence that those folks have had here in the city is, incalculable. The culture that is experienced in New York City is very much defined by indigenous people. So it's hard to find community here in terms of my own community. Do I know other Choctaw people here in Lenape-Hoking? I know one other Choctaw person, and we're not even from the same band. So it's almost like being from 2 different tribes. So I think that there's definitely a fracture in terms of what it looks like to have nationhood support. And when I say nationhood, I mean from our nation, not the United States, but from our nations. But we create a community that is based in proximity to one another, and to literally because we are close to one another, which is something that I've found incredibly valuable because I get to share space with Indigenous people all the time who are totally different than me. We don't even speak the same languages. We do not have the same customs. It's a reminder that of the myth of us being homogeneous, and it really breaks the mythos of pan-indigeneity, which is great and beautiful, and it really asks us to question what does it mean to be Indigenous in an urban space, and what does it mean to be away from our communities often in these spaces. So it's definitely a community. It's just very different than I think some of us who maybe grew up in our community. I didn't grow up in my community, but other folks who grew up on the res or in their communities, it might be a totally different experience for them being here in Manhattan as an urban Indigenous person. You know, I take a lot of pride in being an urban Indigenous person because my indigeneity was so greatly shaped by other urban Indigenous people. And so I take a lot of pride in that, but I can also understand that it can be a bit othering or it can be lonely at times. You know, it's hard, even when you're surrounded by Indigenous people, sometimes you want to be able to talk about the exact same things, the exact same people in the exact same way. And it's really not tangible. So when it comes to talking about this mascot, I find it to be interesting because in terms of being an urban Indigenous person, I feel that sometimes the community is fractured, and because of our literal geographical spatial, where we are geographically. And so when it comes to becoming united against a particular front, I think it takes a lot more consensus building and a lot more conversation and a lot more conversations, as well as trust building, because we come from so many different communities. So it's a beautiful community, but it is very different.
Well, and again, because it's not the community in the sense that you are together often. I mean, there is the Native American Community House, and there are some events that happen, but it does you still can feel inundated because the dominant cultures around you. They can weigh on you, and when you talk even about the Native community there, it's not just that it's a range of Native peoples, but there's also a range of the level of assimilation that has impacted people. We have Native people who are very much Americanized. They and whether it's Native people who have been heavily influenced by Spanish culture, or Native people who have been heavily influenced by American culture, and I use that word really loosely because sometimes I'm not sure how much culture comes into that, but it is difficult. And you and I've talked about voting. We've talked about Christianity and the impact that it's had and that kind of stuff. And we know that many of our Native relatives have embraced various levels of all this stuff, and so it is difficult. And I'll tell you, when you get involved in this mascot issue, now you've got a whole other thing where predominantly it's white people that are defining what that image is, not just what the logo is, but I literally heard people saying, from Cambridge, New York, saying, "Oh, we support our Indian culture." They don't have any Indian culture. It's 97% white, this community. And the amount of Native people are less. They're like 0.3% or something like that. It's really, really small. So there isn't much diversity there. So the idea that they've appropriated an image or a word or their Hollywood idea of what any of that stuff is really it's bizarre. It's creepy on a bunch of different levels.
I do want to rewind just for a second in terms of what we were talking about in urban indigeneity and assimilation, which is that I actually have found my community here in Manhattan is more radical than my community back home.
Good point.
So I think that may be different people's experiences, but my the reason that I feel so much at home here with the indigenous community here is because they are so radical.
That's an excellent that is an excellent point, because and again, part of the reason we changed the name to Resistance Radio is because we are bringing together Native people in the urban Native segment, and those of us who are living on Native territory who are still fighting stuff from impacting us, whether it's environmental issues or whether it's the in the case of like Six Nations, I talk about suburban sprawl coming onto our territories. So we have a lot where we are oftentimes fighting the territories that we live in, to defend those territories. What we share with Native people, especially in the urban environments, is our awareness about the bigger context of indigeneity fighting against assimilation.
I also feel that being an urban indigenous person, and I see myself living in an urban space for a long time, at least on and off for the rest of my life, because I find home within cities. I think that the reason that urban indigenous communities, especially here in so-called New York City, is so radical, or are so radical rather, is because of the intense erasure that happens here. When we talk about New York City, usually the first thing that is discussed is, oh, it's a city built by immigrants. It's a city of immigrants. Very much that when we talk about the United States, we say it's a country of immigrants. It's a melting pot. But New York City is meant to be this is meant to be the beacon of what it looks like to have a city built by immigrants. And the reality is, like, if we're talking about physicality, the city was built by the Mohawk iron workers. If we're talking about culturally, the culture of New York City is mostly and has been defined by indigenous people and Black people. And so, yes, of course, there are immigrants in the city, and yes, of course, like, that is something to be celebrated. But the amount of erasure that happens within the city in terms of how it is defined and how it is seen globally is something that really needs to be disrupted. And so, something that I find that it's one of the reasons that I feel that doing radical work and radical education here in New York City is so important, because you have to remind folks constantly that this might be the epicenter of global capitalism, but it is on indigenous land. This might be the epicenter of global capitalism, but it has the largest urban indigenous community. So we can't, the reason that the work is so important, and what really keeps me here and really resonates with me, is that it is an extreme uphill battle for visibility, to just prove that we exist in this space and deserve to be heard, and not even deserve to be heard. We demand to be heard. We will be heard. We will force ourselves, if we have to, onto the general public to be heard. So I think that that's definitely, and I felt like that clarification is necessary, because I found home away from home, because I found other like-minded individuals who, like myself, I came to New York City to participate in resource extraction. I came here to go to college, to further my career, to live this a very colonial and capitalistic defined life. And what I found actually was a radical community that redefined my own presence within the city. So I think that this kind of conversation needs to be had in a real way, whether spurred on by mascots or whether spurred on by discussions of erasure. All in all, it's the fact that New York City is an indigenous city defined by indigeneity, and we will continue to push that narrative.
Well, the other thing that I think is fascinating to think about is that there's also, because it is a city that brings in people from all over the world, the indigeneity associated with other indigenous peoples from other places becomes. I mean, look, that the amount of Hawaiian people that I've gotten to know, people from New Zealand, people from Africa. So it isn't just about the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere. So the idea of indigenous struggles takes on a more global idea to it. So that and frankly, that's what I find fascinating about going to New York. I don't live there, but up until March of this year, I was going there every single week.
Yeah, it's something that I do a lecture specifically on Indigenous New York City to push back against the erasure because so few people who are born and raised here in the city are so unaware of how much indigeneity defines our movement. Even considering the way that streets are designed, or the way that certain spaces are, where the way certain architects have designed certain spaces, are based off of Lenape lifeways, or even the naming, like Canarsie is the name of the indigenous people whose land we occupy in Brooklyn. Rockaway is the name of indigenous people. Like there are a number of names that they just slip our minds. They're just another stop off the A train or another stop off the F train. But the reality is that we are actually defined by our indigeneity here in our experience every day of New York City.
Well,
so
and even that
as a non-Lenape person, I feel that it is my duty to really push forward that, like, this is still a very indigenous space. Even if it doesn't look that way, you can see it if you're looking for the right thing.
Well, and even this notion of indigeneity is oftentimes so impacted by the land itself. So when you think about New York and it being on the East Coast where the sun rises, and of course surrounded by the kinds of waterways that are there, and all of it. I mean, so there's a certain part of, regardless of whether you're indigenous or not, you're impacted by the same structure, the same geography, the same landscape, even as it's changed with sky, rising skylines and everything else. We are all impacted by some of that same thing, climate, and all of that stuff. So it is one of these things that when you have the conversation, especially and I'm so glad that you've taken the conversation where you have here, because it shows, it gives a little bit more depth to what indigeneity even is.
It really does, and I know we've talked about cities before in this radio space, and personally, you and I and John have spoken about it a lot, and I just feel that New York City, so-called New York City, is such a special place, and it's not because it is the epicenter of global capitalism, but rather it's such a special place within the indigenous plane of existence, and it's something that I wish more people could witness or bear witness to, and I'm hoping that these conversations that we're having will really resonate with non-indigenous people who are listening to grapple with what it means to be in New York City, knowing that it is an indigenous city, and knowing that there are so many intersections of indigeneity here that even as an indigenous person, I was blind to for many, many, many years, until I began to seek it out in a very particular way. So it's for me, these intersections of indigeneity here in Manhattan is so important. And honestly, it's what keeps me here. What keeps me here is that work.
Well, and we're going to talk a little bit more about, we'll take a break here. We'll let Reggie take us out with some music, but we'll take a break here. When we come back, let's talk about what's happening out just outside of the city as we get out to Long Island and Shinnecock territory. I know that there has been, we've covered a number of issues out there, and that effort and that struggle to maintain distinction in the, especially with the lavishness of the area and all that other stuff, that too can be intimidating. So we'll talk about that when we come back. This is John Kane. This is Resistance Radio with John and Regan, and we'll be right back in just a moment. All right, thanks for coming back. Yeah, it's one of my favorite Murray tunes. Just the idea that we don't learn sometimes, and I think it's a classic, lighthearted song coming from a guy who, how's he describe himself? He says he's a red man singing the black man's blues in a white man's world, or something along those lines. But anyway, all right. So Regan, talk to me a little bit about what's going on out in Shinnecock territory.
Of course. So, for those who are unaware, so-called Long Island, specifically the Hamptons, is on Shinnecock land. Shinnecock is an indigenous nation. Their reservation is out there. And as John alluded to earlier, there is an immense amount of wealth in the Hamptons. It's where a lot of people, a lot of celebrities, and a lot of people with money buy their houses. I've been out there specifically for what I'm about to speak about, but I went out there, and it's a kind of a disturbing amount of wealth, but also it's a disturbing reality, which is that there is this reconfiguration of Shinnecock land to portray a very much summer home, second house, third house feel.
Yachts,
so it's very colonialized.
Yachts and all the whole bit, right?
Yes. Oh man, yachts. Like huge. Oh God. I knew that the Hamptons, like, we know what the Hamptons are. Everyone knows what the Hamptons are. I knew that there was immense. I've heard about it in songs. I've seen it in shows, whatever. And I knew that there was immense amount of wealth. And then when I went there, I was actually taken aback by what it looks like, and it feels like a northeastern Malibu is the best way that I could say it. There is wealth, 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 and this is white wealth. So, as you can imagine, because of the amount of money that is put in to creating this illusion, this fantastical illusion of the Hamptons, there is a lot of pushback against the indigenous community that still lives there on their reservation, on their land, in terms of how they exercise their sovereignty. So starting on November 1st, there is a month-long occupation being hosted by Warriors of the Sunrise. Warriors of the Sunrise is a group of indigenous women, specifically Shinnecock women, and it was formed in response to the Shinnecock Nation's struggle to provide resources to its tribal members due to not just hundreds of years of violent settler colonization and land theft, but also due to contemporary constraints that New York State puts upon the Shinnecock Nation. Because for many people that live in the Hamptons, the Shinnecock way of life is a threat to this fantastical illusion of wealth. So this month-long encampment, which is along the Sunrise Highway in the Hamptons, is across from this monument that the nation built a couple years ago. And I know that we've spoken about it previously, but just to catch folks up, the Shinnecock people erected a very large digital sign that often reads a number of different things. It's a 60-foot digital billboard that reads all sorts of stuff. It has some advertisements for local Shinnecock-based businesses, also advertisements for larger national-based, like there was like an NYU Langone digitized billboard sign when I was there. But also they have had a lot of pushback because the sign has, as we spoke about earlier this summer, has also put things up like you're on stolen land, like you're hanging out on stolen land in the Hamptons and things like that. So this very large 60-foot digital billboard has caused concern to settlers in the Hamptons who have said that it is an eyesore, that honestly, it makes them feel uncomfortable because of the things that are put up on the sign, especially the one that had, this sign that, I'm saying, I can't remember the exact quote, but, like you're on indigenous land, pretty much was the reminder. Like while you're here in the Hamptons enjoying what is this, this grandiose illusion of wealth, you're on indigenous land. So Hamptonites have been really pushing for the removal of this giant sign. Now, mind you, the sign is on Shinnecock land. It's not on any sort of contested area. It's not on the highway. It is just right off the highway and is on their land, which means that Shinnecock Nation can do whatever the hell they want to do on their land. And so there has now been a baseless lawsuit in which New York Governor Andrew Cuomo and the Attorney General Letitia James have put this lawsuit demanding that the Shinnecock people remove this sign and remove their what they refer to are demands, which are that they have the right to run their nation economically however they see fit. Just regular sovereignty. Back in 2007, a judge ruled in favor of Shinnecock Nation, saying that they can do whatever they want on their land. They can run their economy however they want. And this lawsuit, this frivolous lawsuit, which is against specifically the monument, is really meant to upheave that decision. Now, in order to combat that, the Warriors of the Sunrise have started this encampment at Canoe Place. And Canoe Place is a traditional space that has been a gathering place for the Shinnecock for time immemorial. And it is literally across the street from the sign on the highway. I had the privilege of camping out at the camp for 4 days last week and
Awesome.
to share space with Shinnecock elders and other Indigenous people, as well as other accomplices and allies who are still holding this space. Every day, camped out, rain or shine, and it was raining when I was there, and it was really cold, to just hold this space to remind people, to remind New York State, to remind Governor Cuomo, to remind Hamptonites that they are on Shinnecock land and that Shinnecock people have the right to live their lives and to provide for their people in whichever way they see fit. So there's a list of demands on the Warriors of the Sunrise website that I recommend everyone looks to. It also provides a more in-depth dive into the very brief history I gave in terms of the court ruling and the sign. And what is being demanded is that New York State must drop the lawsuit against Shinnecock Nation over the sign. They're also demanding a meeting with Governor Cuomo at camp to have these larger discussions, and that New York State must recognize and respect Shinnecock trade and fishing rights. And lastly, the fourth demand is to pass the unmarked grave and protection law. Now, for folks that are unaware of what that is, last year, during the building and the creation of what would become the Shinnecock Golf Course on the Hamptons, not created by the nation, created by Hamptonites, there were graves unearthed, bones were unearthed. Now, if you know anything about law, that is meant, if it is private land, you do not have to stop excavation. If it is public land, you must stop excavation, and you have to have a full archaeological survey to determine if it's a historical area. The privatized company that is building this golf course did not stop and just continued and poured concrete on top of these bones, on top of ancestors. And so there was a number of protests against that in the same area on the same part of the highway. Canoe Place is catty corner to what this golf course. So this is a contentious history in which Hamptonites have continued to build on Shinnecock land, and Shinnecock people have protested and pushed back to just be silenced or for things to violently be pushed through. So this is a larger conversation in which New York State is not respecting tribal sovereignty. So though the main push of this encampment of this space is to force New York State to drop the lawsuit against this large 60-foot billboard, there are other things at play here that, as I said, is at the crux of what it means to be a sovereign nation on Long Island.
Well, and to be clear here, the tensions that exist between a people struggling to basically eke out a living, based on, frankly, what drops off the table from the rich and famous that are out there, or to carve out distinction. Look, there's been ongoing battles about their cigarette trade, and the idea that they've set up retail establishments that have created at least some opportunity in the private sector and for the Shinnecock Nation to create revenue. They don't have a $1 billion casino there. They put up this monument, which was both a sign and a symbol for who they are, but also was an opportunity to create revenue through ad space. I also want to mention that they also put PSAs on this thing. This thing does serve a public good beyond just the idea of selling advertisements. But all of this has to do with these wealthy, predominantly white people who look down upon this people. So this is both a race issue and a class issue, because for the Hamptonites, the mere existence of the Shinnecock people and the Shinnecock territory is something that for them is not just an eyesore, but it's something that they don't feel is consistent with the culture that they've created of the and with their wealth and their lavishness and their own gluttony.
And I also think that's something that needs to be noted that really complicates the conversation is that this is a long history. I only talked about a couple of years, but this is a long history of Shinnecock Nation having to fight New York State, including that back in 1930, the United States government did not maintain the Indian Reorganization Act election at Shinnecock, which would allow Shinnecock to maintain even larger swaths of their own land because, and this is very specific, and I recommend that everyone look up the legal jargon, but because the Indian Reorganization Act did not recognize people who were both Black and Native as indigenous people, but rather as Black people. So this amount of erasure that happens specifically in Afro-Indigenous communities is a part of the issue as well. We're talking about, this is racism on both in an anti-Indigenous way and an anti-Black way.
Well, and again,
people like even Bloomberg has stated that they don't look Indian to me.
Yeah, it's not just Trump saying this.
Even Trump has stated they don't look Indian to me. So a number of politicians who have had a great amount of influence in the Hamptons in terms of construction, in terms of financial support, have made racist comments in saying that this community, because it is a largely Afro-Indigenous community, doesn't look Indian enough to receive recognition, rights, or to have their rights even upheld by the court. So I think this is an incredibly poignant moment in time, incredibly poignant event, because it not only does it discuss Indigenous sovereignty, but it also really brings to light the racism that Afro-Indigenous people and that the racism and the anti-Blackness that even exists within this definition or the stereotypical view of what indigeneity is.
Well, and again, the crazy part is that when you understand the role that not just racism but slavery and genocide played in promoting these alignments of Black and Native people, I mean, it highlights the racism even more. And you're right. I mean, there were many states in the United States that would forbid anybody to identify themselves as Native if they could, argue that there was, again, the one drop rule. Well, if we think you have one drop of Black blood in you, then then you cannot identify yourself as, frankly, you couldn't identify yourself as white or as Native. So there was this real effort to subjugate people into these racial lines that were created by white people. And you're right. You don't have to be on the right or you don't have to be a Trump or Republican or conservative to harbor this level of racism. And I think Andrew Cuomo demonstrates this all the time. And now when you see somebody like Letitia James, you would think, and I always say this, and I have to say this because it isn't true, but you would think when you see somebody who represents an oppressed people, whether it's Jewish or whether it's Black or the immigrant community, you would think there would be a sensitivity, but there isn't. Once there's this level that people reach this level of elitism, this racism and classism just becomes dominant in their own view on how they look down on people.
And I need people to understand this is a contemporary issue. Like, yes, the Indian Reorganization Act removed Shinnecock people in 1930, but that same that passing of the law actually was withheld in 2009 by the United States Supreme Court with the same argument that, so 2009, the same argument that Shinnecock Nation was not eligible to obtain trust land because it was not brought under the decision of the Indian Reorganization Act. So a racist law was maintained again in 2009, even though Shinnecock people are like, hi, we have tribal enrollment. Hi, we have a reservation. Hi, we maintain tribal governance and sovereignty. We follow all of the federal laws that require us as a federally recognized tribe to be able to run our economies the way that we want to run them.
More important, they
are largely Afro-Indigenous.
They meet those standards.
Tribes, the United States Supreme Court still upholds a racist ruling.
Look, I just want to rephrase that, though. The point is that they meet what any of those standards or qualifications would be. It's not so much that they submit themselves under the reorganization law, but they meet. And because again, these laws are always used in a way, and this is what we saw with the Passamaquoddies and the Wampanoags and so many others, where this Indian Reorganization Act, this 1930 or this 1934 rule comes in, where they try to redefine what a Native person is, and then say if you didn't meet that qualification even back then you're limited about what you can do in terms of land acquisition, land rights, and all of that other stuff. It's just a ridiculous thing that they try to make Native people go through. And again, and it doesn't matter a party affiliation. We see this from the left. We see this from the right. And that's why I say, racism isn't just a right thing. It's a white thing. But we also see people of color, Barack Obama and Letitia James that have made, rulings or policies that have been very, 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 very oppressive towards Native people.
And we're going to see the exact same thing with Deb Haaland. She's already said that she will not support Choctaw and Chickasaw freedmen receiving enrollment status, and was just named Secretary of the Interior. So this is a continuation of anti-Blackness within Indian country and within the federal government as well. So I really look forward to unpacking that. And I do want to remind folks that you can support Warriors of the Sunrise. You can go on their Venmo, their GoFundMe, their PayPal, or show up to the camp at Canoe Place. There is this occupation will continue for another week, and there is a call out to people. You must show a negative COVID test and have your temperature taken when you show up. But this is an open call out to people to show solidarity with the Sovereignty Camp.
Regan, great stuff. Thanks again. Look, folks, we are off next week, so we'll see you in a couple of weeks. This is John Kane with Regan DeLoggins, and you've just listened to Resistance Radio. Yahweh.